Imagine being executed, not with a sword, not on the gallows, but by being drowned in wine. Yes, wine. This is the bizarre and infamous tale of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence. A man of ambition, betrayal, and ultimately tragedy, his death has captivated historians and storytellers for centuries. But was this strange execution real, or just a fanciful legend? George Plantagenet was born in 1449 into the House of York, one of the two rival factions in 1549, the Wars of the Roses. He was the younger brother of Edward IV, who would become king, and Richard III, who would famously lose his crown on the battlefield. From an early age, George was destined for a life of privilege and power. As a member of the royal family, he held titles, wealth, and influence. But he also had an impulsive and ambitious streak that would eventually lead to his undoing. The Wars of the Roses were a brutal conflict for the English throne between the houses of York and Lancaster. George, as a Yorkist, should have been loyal to his brother, King Edward IV, but ambition got the better of him. In 1469, George turned against Edward and joined forces with their cousin, the Earl of Warwick, also known as the Kingmaker. Together they plotted to overthrow Edward. George even married Warwick's daughter, Isabel Neville, cementing the alliance. But their rebellion failed. Warwick was killed in battle, and George had no choice but to beg for forgiveness from Edward. The king granted it, but their relationship would never be the same. Despite being welcomed back into the fold, George couldn't seem to stay out of trouble. He grew increasingly paranoid and erratic, accusing members of the court of witchcraft and plotting against his own brother. When his wife Isabel died suddenly in 1476, George went into a downward spiral. He accused her lady-in-waiting of poisoning her and demanded vengeance. This erratic behavior gave Edward all the reason he needed to act. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, was imprisoned in the Tower of London in 1478 after being accused of treason against his brother, King Edward IV. The Tower, historically reserved for high-profile prisoners, was both a place of imprisonment and execution, especially for those of noble blood. Due to George's royal lineage as the king's brother, his confinement was likely more comfortable than that of ordinary prisoners, but his fate was sealed when he was sentenced to death. What makes George's execution infamous is the legend that he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, a story that has captured imaginations for centuries. According to this tale, George's fondness for Malmsey wine, an expensive, sweet wine imported from the Mediterranean, led to this peculiar choice of execution method. While the story is popularized in literature and folklore, including in Shakespeare's Richard III, its historical accuracy remains uncertain. Official records confirm that George was executed in the Tower of London, but they do not specify the method. Historians suggest that George's execution was carried out privately within the tower, which was unusual for the time. Public executions of traitors were typically used as a display of royal authority, but the private nature of George's death may have been due to his status as a royal family member. Executing the king's own brother publicly could have sparked political unrest or scandal. The secrecy surrounding the execution, combined with George's reputation for indulgence, likely gave rise to the legend of the wine barrel. According to legend, George Plantagenet met his end in a butt of Malmsey wine. For those unfamiliar, a butt was a large barrel holding about 126 gallons. Why wine? The story goes that George had a particular fondness for Malmsey, and this indulgence became the poetic justice of his demise. Shakespeare immortalized this tale in his play Richard III, where the ghost of Clarence haunts his brother Richard. blaming him for his death in the wine. But is this tale true? Historians have debated the authenticity of the wine execution for centuries. Contemporary chroniclers like Edward Hall mentioned it, but there's little concrete evidence to prove it actually happened. Some believe the story was exaggerated or invented entirely, possibly as propaganda to highlight George's debauchery or Edward IV's cruel sense of irony. Others suggest it may have been symbolic, a metaphor for George's excessive lifestyle. Whatever the truth, the story persists likely because it's just so bizarre and memorable. George Plantagenet's life was one of ambition, betrayal, and tragedy. His restless pursuit of power alienated him from his family, and his erratic behavior sealed his fate. Whether he truly drowned in wine or not, his death remains one of the strangest tales in English history. So what do you think? Was George Plantagenet really executed in a butt of wine? Or is this just a fanciful tale to make history more dramatic? Either way, his story lives on, proof that truth and legend are often inseparable in the annals of history.